All right, Damo. First off, thanks so much for taking the time to come on and answer my smattering of random yet hopefully useful and interesting questions.
No, no, not
So
at
I
all.
think,
It's really nice to be here.
yeah, absolutely. I think kind of just to set a little bit of the context, I think part of what our conversation I hope will aim to accomplish is teaching people and setting illustrations and examples for maybe how to think, how to look at things, how to approach situations and contextualize internal arts versus necessarily explicitly telling people how or what it to think. So, on that note, the first question I'd like to ask is I think a lot of people have the assumption that Tai Chi or Qigong or Neigong is just something that you can do. Like, for example, I don't lift weights, but I could go to the gym and I could actually lift weights right now. I don't have to do any prep. I don't have to do any real learning or conditioning. I can just do it. I can go for a run. I can go for a swim. I can ride a bike. It's not really like a learning curve. And I've just noticed in myself and a lot of people that this mindset oftentimes carries over. So people are like, oh, I went to a Tai Chi class, so now I am doing Tai Chi, or I did a Qigong class, and now I am doing Qigong. So my actual question is that really correct, the correct mindset? Or is it something that we actually need to develop the right body for or the right conditions for?
Yeah, sure. I mean, from your examples, I guess, what do you say? Going to a gym, riding a bike, going for a run, swimming, were your examples. I guess it's like
Yeah,
anything,
just
isn't it? If you went into a gym and you picked up a weight and you've never done any, I guess you would probably only pick up the small weights, I would imagine. You wouldn't walk straight over to where the huge meaty guys were doing it. And with something like weightlifting, I would imagine there's probably, I'm sure there must be a whole scene where people have refined the things you can do with your body down to anal levels of detail and to become an expert at it. I I think the body, same with cycling, same with swimming, and definitely the same with the internal arts. The body must be transformed in order for you to do the practice. And I would argue that maybe more with something like Qigong or Tai Chi or Neigong, even meditation, actually. People think meditation's an exception, but it's not. Because they are internal arts, is, a little bit of a general classification people give them. The inside of your body must be transformed massively. That's kind of the point of it. So could you walk into a class and just do qigong? No, obviously not at all. You could practice some alignments. You could move your joints around. You could do some shapes that look vaguely like those practices, but no, you wouldn't really be doing it because the whole point of these arts, essentially, I mean, without going off on a tangent, is it's
right.
about transforming your body so that the circuitry is efficient as it can possibly be, so that it can handle the higher levels of the practice. So, yeah, inner transformation is major. The body doesn't function as it's supposed to for the internal arts. It's like normal life, natural life. What we're doing now, sitting down, whatever, is diametrically opposed to what we're trying to do for the internal arts. Internal arts practice or cultivation in general is the antithesis to normal living, I would argue. So therefore, yeah, we have to transform the body so it can do it. Um, I mean, I've been teaching here, right? I'm filming this or talking to you from Bali. I don't know why I couldn't remember where I was there. I'm in Bali. I knew I was somewhere in Asia. Here in Bali, and we've had people here doing the Neigong module with us for nearly 3 months.
Hmm.
And all they've been doing is transforming the body, pretty much. They've done maybe 3 or 4 exercises probably over the last 3 months, repeatedly, every day, all day, slight variations on a theme, but just to get the body converted so that the body opens up and the chi can, well, be found even at the beginning so people know what it is and then learn how to do something with it. But most of the newer ones, when they came here, obviously not the ones with experience, but the newer ones, yeah, they didn't have the right body. It wasn't built for this art. So there's a long process um, to go through, which I'm definitely preaching to the converted because I know you know this anyway. I've seen you actually go through quite a lot of this transformation with your body. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one thing that how my mindset shifted over the years is when I first approached these arts, my mindset was, okay, I need to do this right. I need to do this correctly. I need to figure out the right way to do this thing. And then actually what I realized is that was kind of backwards. Once I switched to how can I do this less wrong?
Yeah.
Because I realized the reality is, let's say I spend 8 hours sitting at a desk and then I go try to do Tai Chi or something. I'm not doing Tai Chi. I'm doing guy who sits at a desk for 8 hours trying to find and work my way towards Tai Chi, which is
Yeah.
different than actually doing Tai Chi. So
Yes.
once those things actually changed in my mindset, I was like, oh, okay. But then that kind of opens up the mindset of it's a process of development rather than like a static thing that like, okay, now I got it, I'm doing it right. Which that's kind of what I think you were getting at with it's a process of transformation, not just like,
Yeah.
oh, cool, good job, you did Tai Chi. See you next week. You know, like,
It's less trying to do something correct than trying to be correct. So that once you are organized correctly and the body is transformed, which is a very specific process, you can't really do it wrong. It's not possible. Like the art on the outside just becomes an expression of what you've transformed on the inside of your body. So if you take something like Qigong, for example, I think one of the mistakes people make is they think that you are kind of the central axis that is trying to do the exercises, rather than understanding the exercises are simply tools that are moving in to change the central axis. They're supposed to be changing you, transforming you, which is kind of ass about face for how a lot of people, I think, would view it, as I did when I first started. I didn't understand that. You think the exercises inherently have some power independent of what they're trying to do on the inside of you, which is incorrect.
I think I just kind of assume that's where the art piece comes into it,
Mm,
since it's a process of kind of who you actually are or whatever the person is that's doing the thing. Which at least
yes.
for me, that can be the difficult piece because I think I mean obviously in terms of Tai Chi and Qigong like the movements aren't particularly that difficult. I mean it's like moving your arms in a circle. Okay, cool. That's not that tricky to get your mind around. It's funny though, actually, I've met people and they were like, "Oh man, the hardest part about doing Tai Chi is just remembering where to put my arms." And I was like,
Yeah.
that's like the single easiest part of the whole thing is just like, okay, your arms are
Yes.
here."
If
So
you think that's hard, join a dance class or ballet, or I can guarantee it's way harder for the choreography, I would imagine.
yeah, I mean, I've never danced in my life and I probably never will. I'll probably die without dancing. So, I mean, I think it's more difficult. But what it means is maybe this is where it's difficult for people because, like, if you're not aware of the person that's doing the art and you're not aware of what's actually happening inside of you, then would that obviously be a hindrance to genuine progression and transformation?
Yeah, after a while it will be. At the beginning, not so much, I think, because
Yeah.
at the beginning, as you know yourself, most of the body transformation is almost on the surface, isn't it? Like pulling open muscles, pulling open joints, stuff like that. Most people can connect with that. But then
Yeah.
after that, it is difficult if because developing an awareness and waking up the inside of the body is yeah, it's quite an exact process. So every teacher will have their own way. My preferred way really is just to ramp up the strength of the movement of chi to such a high level that even the dullest of us out there, such as myself, can still feel what's going on inside because it becomes so strong you can't ignore it. That would be how I would advise people to practice. It's like a volume switch, you know. I think some people keep the volume too low on the strength of their practice, and if you ramp it up a little bit, a lot, then it's not so hard. Then you can feel what's going on the inside. I think one of the things that's difficult sometimes to, I don't know if sell is the right word, to convince people of is that anything that happens internally with chi or with your mind should also be manifest on the level of the physical body as well, right? So when something changes physically as a byproduct of what you're doing internally, normally you can feel that, right? And that's kind of your way in. To move into the more subtle levels, it's almost irrelevant, like subtle
Yeah.
levels of chi or channels or anything. I think for a long time that's irrelevant. Most of the time, when you meet people who tell you they can feel chi or feel their channels, what they normally feel is their nervous system and they feel their skin. It's, so getting people the discernment to understand what they're actually feeling is probably the biggest challenge, I would say.
Yeah, I feel like that's among the many pains in the ass of practicing internal arts. I think
Yes.
chi is obviously one of them because it's like it's one of those things where it's if it's something you've never experienced and you have no real concept of, then you can't even really like imagine. But then how our mind seems to work is just put something new in the context of what I already know and experience. And I
Yeah.
definitely did this myself early on, and I see a lot of people do it of like, oh, you're talking about chi. It must be exactly like all these other things. Or, oh, I felt this thing, whatever, tingling on my skin or some
Sure.
visual thing in my whatever, or I felt happy or sad. Oh, that must be this chi that everyone's talking about. And it's like what I've the conversations I've ruined over the years is always trying to explain to people, no, 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 it's more than that. Like I've been on a few podcasts talking about, internal arts, and the people are always like, that just sounds hard. Like that just sounds difficult. I
Well, they're
don't
not
I don't
wrong.
know. And I'm like, yeah, I know. I'm like, well, yeah, I mean, if you want to be good at anything, it's like
Mm.
obviously going to be, and if you want to start talking about the actual mechanics that make up your human organism, like, yeah, that's probably going to be a little difficult. So I think sometimes that's where a lot of people get tricked up. And even I got tricked up starting off is just realizing the actual dense tangibility of chi that's not subjective, not subtle, not
Sure.
anything. It's like literally something. I mean, it's almost as like to use a crude, disgusting example. It's almost like an orgasm or something, or like going to the toilet. It's tangible, like it's unmistakable. Like you, if you don't know you're doing those things, like you're something's wrong. So it's yeah, that's just something that I have seen in myself. And funny enough, I remember the first workshop I ever went to with you. I think my Dantian actually activated, right? So it was moving around a little bit, and I was getting a little bit of Zifa Gong. And I just say this to illustrate the point. It was happening in me, and I was still so mentally dense that I was like, "Oh, I don't know what's going. I don't believe in this. I don't know what this is." And it was literally in my body. So I'm like,
Yeah.
it can definitely be a barrier in many ways, but it is also very tangible, is my point.
Yeah, and funny. I think I remember you. Well, I remember you obviously, but I remember you going through that very specific part of the process, and it's actually it's one of the most rewarding parts for me when I teach. Out of all the complex things you do later, it's always when people's dantian first consolidates that I take the most pleasure. Actually, watching the mix of confusion. What? Just what the hell's going on, or something like that. And yeah, I think for people to realize that it is, yeah, it's heavy and it's tangible and it forces your body to do all kinds of crazy things as that chi consolidates. Yeah, it's almost impossible to have a conversation with people about what chi is because of, well, everybody has their own concept of it. And until you've got a direct experience of it, it's tricky. It's like when people think that chi is developed by just relaxing and just releasing or something like this. And it's like, well,
Yeah.
it can mobilize that way in the future, sure, but you have to have gathered or found it in the first place in order to connect with that. Otherwise, when you relax, you're going to move what? Blood, lymph, I don't know, release the nerves or something like that, whatever the body does, some nice chemicals from the brain. But yeah, actual chi is a very different thing. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that brings up a really good point, which is number one, the sequential nature of a lot of these things and how if you skip around steps, like you like let's say there's 10 steps. There obviously isn't, but let's say there is. And let's say you gave someone step 9, right? But if they don't have the previous ones, step 9 will probably do nothing and mean nothing to them. And the second thing, and this was a mindset shift for me that was really important, is being able to compartmentalize. Here's what I think, but what does the teacher or the tradition or the practice think or mean? And being able to realize that those are probably not the same thing. And if I already have a shitload of skill, if I have cities, if I have all this crazy shit, then yeah, we're probably on the same, but I don't. So it kind of implies that maybe there's a differential, um, a differential in understanding. So that kind of leads me to my next question, which is the role and importance of compartmentalization in the internal arts. And something I've heard you, mention a few times. And I think it's something that trips a lot of people up. And I think we've already had examples of it through here where maybe people have previous experience, or maybe they have a different tradition, or maybe they're just doing sports or something else, but then they want to do internal arts with a teacher. How important is being able to compartmentalize those things to be able to actually make progress, and then also maybe just define what compartmentalization actually means and looks like for people?
Yeah, sure. I mean, if I answer that question, I would say it's the most important thing and the least important thing, depending on exactly what it is you want from your practice. So I
Yeah.
used to be a lot, when I was younger, I used to be a lot more of a stickler on it, saying it's very important to compartmentalize. And as I've got older, I've eased off a little bit just because I've realized there's two types of student. There are those that are not really wanting to learn this particular practice or any particular practice. They're just exploring stuff
Mm.
and entertaining themselves as far as I can see. And with people like that, if that's what you want, there's nothing wrong with that. But
Mhm.
yeah, like whatever, the compartmentalization is not really that important because the correlations you draw will draw you away from corrections within the art, but most people don't want that. But if you are someone who's serious about really understanding how the arts work or going as far as you can or really understanding what a teacher, a specific teacher is trying to teach you or a specific lineage or a specific tradition, yeah, you must learn to compartmentalize 100% because one of the biggest errors that people make is they'll draw correlations that aren't correct. And if you have a limited understanding, which we all do when we start anything, if I was to start playing the piano tomorrow, I would have a highly limited understanding. I know there's black keys, there's white keys. That's about it. So until you have a lot of knowledge within that particular tradition, you mustn't draw correlations because they'll almost always be wrong. There's the other side to it as well, that any practice or art or tradition is supposed to transform you, as we've already said. So they essentially, the practice or the tradition becomes a set of causes that changes, it causes effects in you. You are the effect that's supposed to arise. So if I don't compartmentalize and think, right now, I am only doing this, I am following these instructions and I'm not carrying through anything from what I've learned before, then you don't know if you've changed those causes. So the effects are not going to arise as they're supposed to. So you might get a slightly deviated version. I don't mean dangerous necessarily, but deviated from what is the norm, or a weaker thing, or what usually happens is you don't learn anything. Because if you're already carrying through what you've done before, then you're just doing
Mhm.
what you did before with a slightly different veneer on the outside. And that even happens within a system. So, say Tai Chi, something like that. I even have to compartmentalize one drill from another drill within the same tradition. I do this drill, and this drill is only trying to achieve this one thing. And then I do the form, and this form is only trying to achieve this one thing. And I don't try to achieve the outcomes of this drill or this form at the same time in my body. I just don't. And I don't need to because this drill is changing this thing on the inside of me. So it'll automatically be carried through to everything else I do anyway. So I don't know if I explained that okay, but
Yeah.
compartmentalization, yeah, like if you really want to go deep, it's really important. The only reason I've softened a little bit as I've got older is, well, probably because you get older and that's what happens. Testosterone drops, you stop being so aggressive, I don't know, and so extreme. But also because I've come to realize that there's fewer people that really, really want to go as far as they can within an art than I had originally hoped. There's more people that want entertainment, exploring a bit, and maybe something to have a good conversation with over a dinner table with some other people so they sound interesting, generally. They may as well be
Yeah,
compartmentalized as those. They can do yoga lattes, and there's no problem with that. I don't.
the Bali buffet.
You do yoga lattes, don't you? You know, Brandon. You do yoga lattes, don't you?
Every morning, man.
That's it.
First thing. No, I mean, I think it reminds me of some of the more kind of the videos that I made over the years that I thought were very interesting, but of course everyone hated. Um,
Okay. That's usually
were
the way.
what's that?
That's usually the way with interesting videos.
Yeah. What I've realized is whether it's a political thing or something related to internal arts or a concept in general, if you keep it very vague and don't define anything so that everyone can project their own thing into it and get an emotional kind of response, then it's a win. But
Yes.
the second you start saying A plus B equals C, everyone's like, well, you're a racist because you use the alphabet, or you're you're an asshole because you assume A is better than B. You know, like it just devolves into all this crazy
Yeah, yeah,
stuff.
of course. Yeah,
So
I mean, I don't, I don't really know why people would be like that though, because one of the most frustrating things for me when I was learning was if I ever went to a vague teacher. If I went to a vague teacher, you think, well, if it's vague, I won't understand it. I can't understand it, and there's no attempt to understand it at all. Why? That's not useful. So I think that the first time you encounter any term with a new teacher, chi, even for example, or
mhm.
no, even more down to earth, release, something like
Yeah.
that. Like that term has to be defined in excruciating finite detail by that teacher so you know what they're talking about because any words are useless, right? We only have shared meaning. If we both say purple, we kind of know what purple means, but even then we'll have
Yeah,
a slightly different view of it depending on how our optic nerves work and all that stuff. So if you start
exactly.
talking about cultivational words, no, they all must be defined because the definition of the word doesn't matter so much as how does that teacher use that word to pass on that particular instruction. It means it's a painstakingly long process at the beginning of gradually defining every single term once you find a teacher that you've decided to study with. No, I agree with you. It's vitally important, but I don't know why people would be upset at definitions. That seems fairly fundamental to us being able to communicate, as far as I can see.
Yeah. Um, I think everything you're saying is especially important if we're dealing with arts where all the words we're using are translations of other words. Do
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
yeah,
So it's like
yeah,
there's obviously massive opportunities for things to get lost or massive opportunity for all of this just assumption to get thrown onto it. But to answer your question, I think the reason why people got so mad about that video in particular is because
yes.
the video was what is spirituality? So
Ah, oh,
I
really?
basically I basically wrote down all of the things that I've perceived actually drive people into it, whether it's
Right. Okay.
sense of community or sense of meaning or purpose or hedonism or like self-help psychology thing or drug, like all these different things that I've seen people actually being driven by. And then I was like, over here is like connection to spirit directly,
Sure.
which is what the word means. And I'm like, look, I'm not there personally, just saying like definitions of the term, this is what this word means and kind of always has meant, versus these are all these other different things. And like that,
I get it. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah.
I can see why that would upset people, actually. Yes. Yeah, I
Well,
get it.
my main thing was just like, look, if you get clear about what you're doing and why you're doing it, maybe the way you're going about it isn't actually the most efficient way to achieve those things. Like if you just want connection and community and you know, oh, I just want connection and community, then like don't maybe you don't have to spend $20,000 going to these workshops and like trying to suffer yourself through all this intense stuff when you can just find easier, quicker, cheaper ways to fulfill that need. That was kind of my basic idea. But again, it was just an example of kind of what we were saying is I was trying to, at least in my own head, ask, well, what do they mean versus what do I think it means or what's my experience, and then being able to actually
Sure.
compartmentalize those things. So,
Rather than being offensive, that should be useful because that means that somebody who, say, they decide to study with you, they want to come and train with you, at least they now know what your definition of spirit is so that they don't go to the wrong teacher. So those kind of definitions should be given, whether offensive or not, by every single teacher so that everybody knows, okay, well, I don't agree with that person because I think that, community or hedonism is an important part of my path. So I won't go to that guy. Surely
yeah,
it's less helpful if nobody defines it whatsoever. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I don't get it. I'd rather
yeah.
know.
I guess maybe as pretty compartmentalized individuals, it's hard for us to understand.
The opposite of unification. Divide everything up into segments. Far more useful at the beginning, I think.
The path of
Union later.
fragment. Yeah.
Totally.
So I think this kind of relates perfectly to my next question, which is the idea that we kind of live in this information age, this golden age, this peak experience of humanity, which, to be honest, yeah, exactly. Yeah. But I mean, a lot of people actually believe that. And I remember I did do
Yeah.
a video on it and was like, actually, guys, we're at a low point. Um, like, in terms of, like, if you think doing ice baths and ayahuasca is like the pinnacle of the spiritual potential of human beings, then I'm very
Yeah.
sad. Like I'm emotionally upset by that. Uh,
But it's one up on
so
yoni eggs or something. So, you know,
yeah, well, you do the yoni egg while you're on ayahuasca, while you're in the ice bath.
right. Guaranteed success.
Then it's more spiritual because you're doing more things. Um,
Great. Is this what happens if I come study with you? Is this what we do?
well, I mean, I probably shouldn't have given away the inner door practices, but that's that's what we
I,
do.
I live in a town where half the occupants here in Ubud, I think, are walking around with a jade egg in at all times. Actually, I my mind despairs at what people think spirituality is, but I keep it inside. I quietly seethe. That's the best way.
I wonder. I mean, I remember being a kid and seeing those funny news stories about people getting like odd objects stuck in their butt and having to go to the hospital to get like a GI Joe or like a Lego car pulled out of their rectum. I just wonder in
Right.
Bali how commonly these people have to go to the hospital.
I'm sure. I don't know. Probably fairly often. Yeah, maybe I should get on my podcast. I'll interview a Balinese nurse. See if we can
Yeah.
find out what's the
Yeah.
horror stories of the place.
So, anyways, the point of my question was people tend to take this idea over and assume that, oh, I go to the bookstore and I bought a book on Buddhism, or I went on Gaia.com or YouTube and I watched like a class on whatever thing. So I know what these traditions are. I have the best, most authentic information because we live in an information age and, all the real stuff is out there for us to easily access. Um, so I wonder if you could talk about how accurate that belief is, and then
Hmm.
how how much stuff is actually legitimately completely off the map, off the radar.
Yeah. Okay. That's a long question to answer, actually. I mean,
Oh,
I can answer it. It's okay. Just yeah. So I think that again, it depends what level you're looking towards studying more than anything else, because as you know,
sure.
things, if they originated from an original source or from a lineage or a tradition, they get kind of, they branch out and they get simplified, essentially, to make them more useful for the populace. And I think that happens because, say, for example, Qigong or Neigong, which was originally an art to connect with spirit, which probably matches your definition of spirituality, I would imagine, from what you said. That was their aim, and they're trying to lead people through that process. But then they find as a byproduct that there's a bonus of it, that it also increases your health or improves your well-being or something. So rather than it being for just this elite few anymore, they create a kind of more public version that is more beneficial to lots of people. So there's that kind of social responsibility that these arts have had, in which they've changed. So the reason I'm saying that is because a lot of what you can find online or in books is that level that has been made more available to the public. So I think on that front, actually, yeah, you can access that kind of stuff a lot more easily than you could do in the past. I think that's
For
true.
sure.
You know, Qigong exercises to move up and down, to breathe better for stress and alleviate joint pain. You can find tons of that kind of stuff for sure. And I think that with a little bit of assistance from a teacher, you can take that information and make it work for you. But then you have the other level. You have the sort of direct cultivational aspect, alchemical aspect, if you want to call it, of that within the arts. No, you still can't. No, that's still not out there publicly. I mean, you see little, you see snippets sometimes. I was talking to someone the other day that there was a Facebook group about, I don't know, Mopai, high level, whatever, I don't know, all that kind
It's
of
always
stuff. And they
Mopai.
it's always Mopai. Everyone's obsessed with the Mopai. But it was all that this kind of high level alchemical Facebook forum. And I don't really go in these groups usually, but I skimmed through it. And it was just nonsense, 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 rubbish, bollocks, nonsense, all the way through with, 100 likes, a load of comments and stuff. And then I just skimmed past this one practice that I was like, wow, how did that get in there? That's actually like a hidden practice that's been hidden for a long time. Nobody looked at it. It just sort of skimmed past. So it showed
Yeah.
me that even if you have all of the information at the tip of your fingertips, human discernment is not at the level that it's able to even identify that is the actual authentic practice. So even if all of that information was out there, most people, the vast majority of us, still would not pick up on it. So it'd be almost irrelevant. And then aside from that, like even if you did have that information, if you could weed through the sort of needle in the haystack and find that practice
Sure.
online or whatever, don't people know anything about empowerments or transmissions or Baisha or traditional conveying of information from one person to another? I mean, the whole nature of internal arts, certainly meditation, 100% meditation. Like meditation without those ingredients is fruitless. And then Qigong and Neigong are only the same to a lesser degree, but still contain it. That there has to be something that is passed directly from a teacher of a certain level of skill. They have to get past a certain level to the
Yeah.
person that is learning, that it's not based upon biomechanics or anything like this. So, for example, I teach online, as was the way that life has gone, and that's the way that things have transformed for our society these days. But I would never lie to people that you can learn the foundations, you can learn a certain degree of skill. You can even,
Right.
actually, I've been surprised at the levels people can get from that, pleasantly surprised. But
Yeah.
you can still never go really, really to the end of a process, if you want to call it that, or super deep, because you require direct connection and transmission from a teacher. Transmission, do I need to define that? Probably. I don't mean like a verbal passing on of information on
Yeah.
someone. I mean somebody to
Yeah.
actually manipulate the yin and yang energies of the body so that they guide you through the process in a way that you can't do for yourself. So the information age is useless anyway if you don't have access to that source material, that person that can help you with that side of it. But I think that's probably one of the more controversial parts of the internal arts, because a lot of people come from a more materialist or Western physiological mindset. So even that concept would be a little bit out of
Yeah.
their realm of acceptance, I would guess, something like that. Has information helped people? Not really. I mean, I wouldn't say people are much happier at the moment, are they? I mean, with all this information that they're receiving all the time, it's not like I walk out into the world and go, wow, it's like a veritable utopia compared to the
Yeah,
80s when I was a child because of all this information. So I don't, I can never speak really negative about the information age because it's enabled me to connect with and reach a lot more people, but
for sure.
I'm not convinced of its value. I'm not convinced of its value at all with that regards. Sorry, I probably went off on a tangent there a little bit.
No, it's all good. I think there's definitely a few takeaways there. The first is it's always odd to me that people want to do internal arts, whether Neigong or Qigong, but then they're weirded out by Qi. It's like, well, then why? I mean,
Yeah.
I had this conversation when a few years ago I first moved to Portland. This friend of mine was like had did a Chinese medicine degree in Portland and whatever. I'd met a lot of people here, and they're all like, "Oh yeah, we don't care about Qi. We don't believe in it." I'm just like, well, then why do you do Chinese medicine? And this guy, he was like a meditator and all these things, and I'm like, well, why? What are you doing? So
Right.
that's
Okay.
that's always odd to me. Um, the second thing is that from everything you're saying, it seems like it's safe to assume there's different, let's say, categories of practitioners, different degrees of interest, different degrees of commitment. And then on
Yes.
top of that, within the traditions, there's different teachings, different information, different practices depending on someone's level or skill level or attainment. So it's like a beginner who, I don't know, just wants to do it once a day or once a week for an hour is not getting the same information, the same teachings, the same practices as the guy who's clocking 4, 6, 8 hours a day every day for 30 years, right?
No, and shouldn't do either. That just
Yeah.
shouldn't do. That's not right for the person who's doing an hour on a Wednesday night to get access to the same level material as someone who's training full time. There would be no justice in that, I don't believe.
I feel like that's sometimes a lot of a struggle for a lot of people, I think, is they feel like I'm doing this, I showed up, so I should get all of this. And
Yeah.
I feel like it kind
Well,
of cuts both. Sorry, go ahead.
no, go for it. No, no, please go, go.
Oh, well, I was gonna say, I feel like it kind of cuts both ways. You said there would be no justice in the, complete beginner, not interested getting the same as the person at the top. But also there is kind of like an injustice where it's like if you're not actually going to put in the time, the energy, the dedication, the commitment, the seriousness, then you actually
Yeah.
don't really possibly get anywhere. And also too, it seems like, at least for my personal opinion, it seems like traditions don't really care. Like if you don't progress or you don't do whatever, they're really not worried about it. Like it's not like shopping at Walmart, like customer satisfaction isn't really guaranteed or something like that. It's almost like this harsh injustice. Because I mean, I've seen it. People that, don't really know that much, don't train that much, come in and they make a bunch of progress. And then other
Yeah.
people put in lots of hours and they just spin their wheels. So it's like, as you said, there's some justice to it, but then it's like on the flip side, there is also kind of a lot of injustice as well. So it's kind of a different layers of
Yes.
complexity to it.
I mean, that's probably the same with anything, though, isn't it? I mean, if you have five people who go and take up a competitive sport, rugby or American football or something, I bet there's people that make progress faster than there are others who put a lot of work in. There's so many
True.
variables from person to person.
Right.
But I think that aside from that, like, I think the view that it's it's complicated actually. I have support for and criticism of how traditional lineages in Asia view or approach the teaching of students. Actually, I have mixed feelings on it. I think on
Sure.
the pragmatic side, you have to remember that as a cultivation art, a cultivation practice, you are the results of your practice. There isn't anything you're trying to do. It's not like you do the art to get a better car or something like that. That's not the aim.
Yeah.
You are the fruits of your practice. So almost like how fast you progress compared to somebody else or something, it really is irrelevant. It doesn't make any
Right.
difference. You are given the tools in order to cultivate your training. But the traditional view would be, once we've given you the tools and we have assisted you to a relevant level to your effort and a relevant level to your potential, which is really as part of it, then everything else is up to you. You have to then do that work, and you either do it or you don't. And because the arts are aiming for possibly the most difficult endeavor a human being can ever do, which is,
Yeah.
to use the English word rather than the Asian, enlightenment. And I know that people would say that's an English term. I always get criticism when I use the word enlightenment, but it's because it's an easy English term that I mean completion of the path, you know? Because it's such a difficult thing for people to do. It's literally the hardest thing on earth in this life you will accomplish. Then you have to accept that probably there's going to be a fair degree of failure. And probably percentage-wise, the majority of us will fail on that path, because I'm really sorry, but there's hardly anybody on this planet who's awakened or enlightened in any way, shape, or form, no matter how many people would say such a thing. So if we are going to engage with a difficult practice, there are going to be injustices, there are going to be variances between us, and there are going to be different potentials and different outcomes. That's just the nature of life. I don't think people realize in these arts that if you're after completion of it, you've got a better chance statistically of becoming a top Hollywood actor and making millions, or a pop star tomorrow. The percentage is much higher of you achieving those things. So if you choose something difficult, it's going to be hard. But then my criticism of the traditions and the lineages, if I were to give one major one, is that to preface this view, if people don't know me, they've got no reason to listen. Well, if they do know me, they've got no reason to. If they know me really well, they've got even less reason to listen to me, to be perfectly honest. But I have spent a fair amount of years researching these things, like the entire of my life, in one way or another.
Sure.
And having been around lots of these lineages, one thing that really does horrify me is that in the old days, traditionally, the ethical and moral conduct of the student was considered a major component of what they had access to. Whereas in modern days, it seems like that has been dropped. So that you can get by with effort, you can get by with potential, you can get by with, just, well, brown nosing. I've seen that happen too. Like you have all these things, your tools you can use, but the moral and ethical code of the student is not looked at in the same way as it used to be within the Eastern traditions. And I think that that's a real shame, because in the, and it's even spoken about within the lineages as well, that you would only have had access to certain teachings if you could demonstrate over a period of time to your teacher that you were apprenticed to, that you had the moral character that was required to receive that teaching as well. And I personally think that should come back. I think that should come back in a huge way, especially with regards to the negative behavior we see taking place within many spiritual traditions, from the people at the top of it as well as the people in the center of it as well. And I'm pro that for sure, but lineages and traditions have changed now. I mean, there are still some that are very hidden, going back to one of your previous questions, that are not, you won't find on Facebook, you won't see them discussed particularly publicly, and sometimes when you do see them discussed publicly, they're actually distorted or untrue versions of their practices. They're normally, by as far as I can make out, some strange character on the internet who never left his mum's basement, who claims that they have connection to this tradition, that just make up some practices and they become
Mopai.
no names, but like a whole it's like a whole new lineage just sort of appears from his mum's basement or something like this. So I mean, like, those hidden practices, those hidden lineages that still aren't discussed, they still will teach people if they can meet them and pay enough money and spend enough time there and things like that, and there isn't enough explanation of the character. So I've met some people that I would consider fairly, at best, immoral, at worst, deviant, I would say, with regards to their character, that do have access to the upper echelons of some of these traditions sometimes, which I find very worrying. I'm not happy with that development within these traditions. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think kind of what's implied here is that
Mm.
people are accessing these powerful things, right? And then
Yeah,
there's some
very good.
correlation to moral character. So obviously there's if it's power, then obviously there's risk, right?
Mm.
I feel like that's what you're getting at, and that's
Yes.
at least in my opinion, maybe one of the at least kind of mundane, practical, brass tacks kind of reasons is like if you all of a sudden now you have all this power, maybe you have cities, maybe you have insight, maybe compared to your level of perception, people are like dogs to you or something, right? Or like they're just so predictable and banal and basic that if your moral character is just maybe not so great, there's a lot of a lot of risk there, let's say.
Mm.
Possibly another element is just maybe the health risk, right? Maybe if someone hasn't purified their system to a degree
Yes.
and all of a sudden here's a bunch of power, then, I feel like chi, as you've called it many times, is just a shit magnifier.
Yes. Completely.
Positive or negative, whatever's there just gets stronger. It kind of it
Yes.
seems to not care whether it's your anger and frustration or your joy and happiness. It just is like here, let's
Yes.
feed it.
Completely. Yeah. 100% it does. And let's not pretend that, as unpopular a view as it may be, that let's not pretend that any advancement in skill within an internal art brings power, because it does. It brings more power. It can start right from the beginning. Like if you even if you manage to build more chi, well, even on a basic level, before it's done anything else, before it's even affected your mind, it's already brought you what? More physical strength, more well-being, more vitality. Well, that instantly gives you more charisma and influence within a space, within any social setting, before we even talk about anything esoteric. Then what about if that chi field starts to radiate out, as in the magnetism around your body gets stronger? Well, you're instantly more attractive to people in within your space, and I don't necessarily mean sexually, but it might be your viewpoints. Yeah, that sort of there's an allure to you that kind of arises around you within that direct vicinity when you sat around the table with people, and that's power. That's what it is. That's power, and that's before you even get deeper and deeper and deeper into higher levels of perception and stuff like this. There's so many inherent dangers within that that should the question would then be, no matter how many times people think they are entitled, is the word, to information on these traditions, should they be? Is
Right.
it safe for these informations to appear on Dao bums or Facebook groups or whatever, like just for anybody to access? Because you're basically going, if you do have an authentic method, here is a way for you to be more powerful. By the way, we're just guessing that you're ethically going to use that ability in the way that it should be. So that I'm I think there's a risk there. There's a big risk there to that side of the training.
Absolutely. I can say from at least my personal experience that
Mm.
the first few years of training, my residual anger and frustration was not improved. It was definitely,
Yes.
which, I mean, it sucked, obviously, but it made
Mm.
it so apparent that I couldn't kind of ignore it anymore. So at least for me, I've definitely had, a myriad of dark nights of self-reflection, but at least from what I've noticed, the process has made it more apparent. It's like, oh,
Yeah.
this is an actual issue, and then making it apparent actually in my body. So it's like, oh, this actual mental emotional thing, this is what it's doing to my actual body. And then I
Right.
realized like I can take every supplement on the planet, I can do all of these things, but if this actual pattern doesn't shift, then it doesn't shift. Like
Yeah.
I eventually got to the point to where, like I just stopped getting any kind of body work from people or even acupuncture and all these different things. Cause I'm like, these people really can't do anything to me. Like I don't really feel or notice anything because I think I have more chi than they do. So it's sometimes I'm like, I'm treating them like they're feeling great after this, and I just feel like tired or whatever. But at least for me, it just made all of this stuff more tangible, more obvious, more dense. And then I could,
Yeah.
use different aspects of the training to, release, open up, whatever, and try to move through it. But also like aggressive self-reflection and
Yeah.
trying to be a better person, trying to be nicer, trying to not just repeat the same stupid, dysfunctional things that maybe I'd done for the rest of my life prior. And I think this leads me to my next point because you're talking about, moral character and these different things. I kind of assume that's probably why every kind of outer door religion, it kind of says the same things to people, like be a nice person, be good, don't kill, like don't have sex with your neighbor's wife, don't steal your neighbor's food, like just these very basic moral guidelines. Because, and this
Unless
might
your wife
be,
has an affair and then stone her to death. Don't forget that one too.
or just say now you're polyamorous because you're progressive and it's 2023 and marriage is oppression and you're actually,
Sure.
you just go that route, which is what people are, doing now.
Times have changed.
Yeah. But it kind of just circles back to possibly the importance of those things. And possibly that's where maybe we all need to start, like
Yeah.
maybe get some of these things in place. And then this leads to kind of the more probably offensive thing that I think is hilarious is that the way I've interpreted a lot of things is that the actual view many of the traditions have of people isn't particularly high, like in terms of like where we all start. Because the common mindset is like we're spiritual beings and all this good stuff is already inside of us and blah blah blah. But I feel like a lot of the traditions are like actually you're barely beyond apes, and maybe we'd like to get you being less of an ape and maybe more of like a human. Is that maybe a fair assumption or?
Yeah. I agree with all of that. I agree with that. There's so a couple of points there that you were talking about. Well, the first
Sure.
one absolutely is morals and behavior were the start point for how a human being should begin to look at cultivation, of course. So your first step on any path of cultivation, whenever I'm asked, especially by young males, it's normally the ones who ask,
Always.
where should you start? And what they want to know is how to breathe or how to sit or how to build chi. And if it's in a personal conversation, then I will tell them that they need to clean up their life and their morals and their ethical code and all those things like pornography and pointless media need to go, and constantly critiquing societal values to the point where they don't exist anymore. That needs to go as well. Like you have to understand that there's a way of being in the modern age that doesn't really match how these arts were practiced in the beginning and all those kind of things, which is often kill or cure, make or break, I guess, with someone. Because if I'm teaching a class, I don't talk about these things so much. I kind of hint at them. But if someone asks me in a one-on-one conversation, it's normally when a student will know whether they want to train with me or not, because they'll realize I have quite old-fashioned values, ethics, and morals compared to maybe a lot of other people these days. But those only match exactly what the religions and the traditions told people in the first place. I do think that stoning your wife to death is probably a little outdated, and we need to move
Yeah.
forward a tiny little bit beyond such things. So, even religions and spiritual traditions suffer from a certain degree of being from a different age. They might need modernizing a little bit to make them more relevant these days. But, okay, put it this way. One thing that always surprised me when I met highly attained, awakened people that, or close to, which is a
Sure.
very small number of people in my life, a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of people compared to all the teachers I met, they're all quite conservative. They really are. Like with regards to their values, they're surprisingly conservative people. And I don't mean they're MAGA, but they are certainly have more old-fashioned values with how people should be. You should be, you know, uh, moral with your sexual behavior, and they're pro-marriage and they're pro children as well, having that family unit, and they're pro giving money to charity as well, and they're against any kind of sort of deviant conduct at all, which is, you know, perhaps it's easy to see how the stronger that sort of moral or ethical compass that somebody had, that sense of values, the more it would serve as a kind of sail to help you kind of navigate these waters that you're trying to go through in these practices. So that's your first step more than anything else. If your moral conduct is not right, then neither is anything else. Your energy, your emotions, your physical health, your body, like nothing. If you're deviant on one level, you're deviant on all levels. Is essentially the the basis of it that needs correcting, you know. And then you asked on something else. Well, sorry, I apologize. What was the second bit you asked about of the morals and ethics then?
Oh, just the tradition's view of people as like
Ah, yeah, 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 of
I
course.
said people commonly assume that it's this sort of like we're all spiritual beings having human experience, like this kind of inflated
Yeah.
positivity versus I think I actually experienced it as their view was quite low of where most humans are starting from.
Yeah, that you're, I mean, what you're kind of hinting at, I suppose, is that kind of new idea people have. If you're already perfect as you are
Yeah,
inherently Buddha nature or whatever, you know, those kind of phrases. I would say that it's half true. It's
right.
not that you're spiritually perfect. You have spiritual potential, I think is more
Yeah,
accurate. You have a large amount of human beings, all human beings have a large amount of spiritual potential in them. There's a potential for divine connection at the highest level. But we're not there. No, no. The view is within the traditions that, I mean, you know, Buddhism talks about people largely being ignorant, don't they? I mean, if I call you ignorant, it's not a compliment. If I were to say,
no,
Brandon, you are ignorant, you would assume I was being rude or disparaging to you in some way. So the
right.
view of humans would match that. And Taoism was like straw dogs, right? Which the idea being that the straw dog was something that was venerated within a sort of ritual, but then ultimately burnt and discarded at the end. The implication being that again you have a large amount of spiritual potential, but the actual vessel of the human existence that you have is kind of pointless. And so, no, there is a very downwards look upon human beings, certainly within the Eastern traditions. I mean, how could you possibly think with the view of the human body being something that's full of defilements, you know, with yogic practices talking about the biles and things that exist within you and the imbalances, and I mean, they're not very flattering towards human life at all. No, I think you almost kind of strike on even those 2 points. Really, kind of strike on two of the difficulties that I think modern people might have with these arts. I would have had the same problem when I was younger. Is that you
Hmm.
have to have the strength in yourself to develop a strong moral code and sense of right or wrong. That, and generally, the stronger your moral code and sense of right or wrong, the less you give in to things that feel good for you. That's really what it comes down to, isn't it? I mean, most of those rules will prevent you from succumbing to your desires and do things that are purely beneficial for yourself to the detriment of others. That that's the basic rule of it. And most people don't want to do that, especially not when they're younger. I didn't want to do that when I was younger, not at all. And then the second component of it is that, you know, we have to have strong enough sense of self-esteem that we can accept that perhaps there's some work to be done because we're
Yeah,
not we're not fine the way we are. So you have to be able to accept that fact whilst not letting it completely emotionally cripple you on the inside. And those things are quite, I think those things are quite difficult. And I think they both stem from the same thing. I mean, I think that deviant behavior is quite normal in society these days, and often it's stemming from a lack of strength. You don't have the strength to do what is right or moral anymore. So you're stuck in a level of self-justification instead, which is a dangerous place for you and other people around you to exist. And then on the
yep,
other side, you don't have enough self-esteem to accept that maybe there's some work to do on yourself, which is, I didn't even think was a big issue. I didn't think that was a deal. I assumed, I mean, my whole life I've assumed I'm not perfect. That was just kind of the assumption I
yeah,
had whilst moving through life. And I thought everybody assumed the same. But it turns out I was wrong. So, I mean, even outside of these spiritual arts, whether you like them or not, is almost irrelevant. There is, speakers like Jordan Peterson have become fairly well known in the public
Right.
arena, and it was interesting for me watching how people reacted to someone like this. To me, I just thought he was a guy speaking some common sense in a fatherly way, as much as anything. He says some
Right.
dumb things from time to time, but he is a very sensible figure. But one of the the critiques or the things people were upset with was by him saying that you might have some work to do on yourself. And I thought that was like the least offensive thing he said out of all of his stuff. That was the one people had problems with. That
Yep.
perhaps because mummy and daddy said you were perfect when you were younger, they were lying. It's an odd concept. But those two things should be the start point for cultivational practice, in my opinion, yes, for sure.
Yeah.
If you can't
It
organize
definitely
the value,
it definitely reminds me of something you said, I think in like 2018, which when I heard it at first, I was just kind of like, nah, fuck that, whatever.
sure.
It was something to the degree that the majority of people, the majority of the time, function off of sex and conflict.
Yeah,
And it was something like that. You might have used different words, but it was basically like sex and fighting or power and conflict,
yeah,
something like basically those two core drives. And when I first
yeah,
heard it, I was just like, yeah, whatever. Like, I don't know about that. That's a little harsh. And then over time, it just kind of was there, and then it just seeped into my experience. Then I was like, oh, huh. But in how that sometimes how that translates to actual internal training, at least for me, is that I think on the positive side, I experienced it giving me a tangible feedback loop. So like if I did something shitty, I felt shitty. I was like, oh,
yes,
huh. Because like I'd say I did some training, so it's like, wow, I feel good. I feel open. Things feel sunk. I feel, more balanced than I did before. And then I do
yes,
something, I get super angry, or I'm an asshole, or whatever other bad habit I might have had, and I'm like, ugh, I feel a lot worse. And I'm like, well,
yes,
that's kind of annoying because I just did all this work to feel good. And I'm like, okay, well, maybe I should not do that anymore, or at least try to start minimizing it and weeding it out of my personality. Not that I've
yes,
necessarily made progress or I'm whatever, but it's at least the mindset of, oh, but I think on the positive side, for people who have the mindset, it can actually start to give you a tangible sense of your actions and their actual consequences, which I think can be useful because if you're not aware of it, then usually who cares? I'm not aware of it, or I do something and I don't really experience the negative effect. So it's like, whatever. But you actually start to really feel the negative effect. And I guess unless you're insane, you might actually be like, I don't know about this. So yeah, that just is kind of like goes back to what we've been saying about how the arts are like you're the product. And I feel like in some ways, enhancing that mind body connection can really give you a much stronger, kind of more objective, tangible mirror for like what you're actually doing instead of morality or whatever these things being like just a vague kind of concept that
yes.
someone tells you you should do. It actually becomes like a real tangible thing that you relate to in like a really visceral way.
Well, what you're talking about there really, to me, is one of the most fundamental parts of who we are as human beings, which is your conscience. That's really it is. I mean, we all watched Pinocchio when we were younger, and this idea of Jiminy Cricket on the shoulder. It's a fairly fundamental part of who we are, but it is a part of our being that maybe is not given the importance anymore that
Exactly.
it should be within our society. And the more you start to connect with that part of your nature, then yeah, you'll feel it. Your conscience is going to kick you in the ass because all of the morals and the concepts and the what do you call them, precepts and things like this are almost irrelevant in some ways, because if you can truly connect with your conscience, you know what's right, you know what's wrong. Everybody does. Everybody knows
Right.
what's right or wrong. You know when you've done something to your betterment or to your benefit that is not good for you. I mean, I always think that that's where a lot of teenage depression comes from on some level, and the whole kind of emo or goth movement. It's almost like a battle with this sort of phase you're going through in your teenage years, where all of a sudden all these drives kick in, where you become, these things I want to explore and do for myself to feel good, and but at the same time I'm guilty about it, and my conscience is there. So it creates this kind of sort of disparity, this tear that we have to go through. And a part of cultivation is about taking those two sides of your nature and making them work together. And you're not going to do it through self-justification. You're only going to do it through following that conscience, because as you say, eventually you're just going to realize, oh fuck, I feel really shitty. I feel really crappy. This is not good for me at all, let alone anyone else. And on a practical level, all right, I'll give you two pragmatic aspects to it. One of them, you can't keep your mind inside. That's
Yeah.
it. You can't keep your mind inside. You try and shut your eyes and sit there and not even meditate. Just bring your mind into your body for more than 5 minutes. If your body is, if your insides are polluted by your mental defilements because your conscience has been torturing you for ages, you're just going to get thrown out. Your awareness does not like to be in there. And then the second aspect to it as well is, even esoterically within alchemy, there's a kind of chi, kind of yang chi, that we need to release from inside the sacrum that will not be released from inside that area of the body while you still have a battle going on with your conscience. It just won't happen. It won't be released. So it even kind of, on some level, blocks you in your practice to a certain degree, leaving you with two options. You either make peace with your conscience by becoming a moral and ethical person, or you live as a total sociopath, which some people will do, because if you're sociopathic, it doesn't torture you and that energy will be released. But I don't even know, maybe psychologists would disagree, but can we train ourselves to be sociopaths? I'm not sure. I don't know. I don't know if that's inherent or not. But I certainly have too big a conscience for that. So I have to go down the moral path instead, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think if one thing that I've seen a lot for myself and people that I've known is, and especially in modern times, I feel like there's a tendency for people to take mundane problems or simple things and make them some big spiritual, existential, cosmic kind of problem. And I think more often than not, what it comes down to is what we're talking about here, which is internal moral conflict or internal conflict with your conscience. And because I think once there's that break, you just, I feel like the best way to describe it is you just kind of start lying to yourself and you start just, or self-justification, I guess is the word you use, but it's also kind of like a form of your lying to where you know this thing is true, but you're telling yourself this other thing is true. And that just creates an internal conflict. And then you just keep building layers on that.
Yes.
And then of course that manifests health problems, liver qi stagnation, whatever else, like all these other things that just start to coalesce and constrict in the body, whatever. And then people go and like, oh, it's this esoteric spiritual thing, and they go into all these things, or they, I don't know, get caught up in like therapy or whatever. And I can tell you, like, when I tried actual traditional talk therapy, we can we can save how amazing that was for a different conversation, but it was mostly just her looking at me like I just farted or something. She's just like, like
Okay.
this complete confusion and in contempt, whatever. But part of what I was like trying to explain to her was this basic concept is I think what winds a lot of people up is just all these layers of kind of lying to themselves because of that something is inherently not even really jiving. And then if you think about what we were saying earlier about the fixation with all these political ideologies and social justice warrior or even like extreme MAGA people, I feel like any of those extremes is oftentimes just a compensation for this internal kind of conflict. So,
Yes. Yeah.
which again, those are all very unpopular opinions, and I think is another example of how the internal arts are opposite with how life actually works. Because it seems like the natural human tendency is build, 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 reinforce, build, reinforce, feel stronger, feel more justified. Whereas the internal is like, actually, no, just let's peel back layers.
Yes, completely. And all of that brings us to really the two most important qualities for spiritual cultivation, not necessarily for chi building, but for cultivation itself. And one of which is truth, is that if you want, like, it's a truth, even as an archetypal quality, is the nature of spirit. It can be nothing but true. That's it. So if I'm lost in a place of dishonesty and building these layers of lies, then I'm already unharmonizing myself with that quality. I'm deviating from it. So it makes it harder to find the spiritual nature of your practice anyway. And then the other quality is acceptance, because how do you find truth is through a deep level of innate acceptance. But it's not, acceptance of other people is obviously very, very important, of course, and other people's ways that they live and things. But the most important quality of acceptance is yourself. And it's not that you have to accept all the awful, terrible things that your conscience is torturing you about. As much as anything, it's don't do the things that your conscience tortures you about, because then it's much easier to accept yourself. That's not rocket science, but those are kind of fundamental core truths to the spiritual arts that it almost feels like every spiritual sage has been trying to say for generations and generations and generations. But of course, there's a small niche of teachers, I guess, that were a little different, such as the people always point to crazy wisdom or some of the tantric methods or things like that. But those were a very, 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 very small percentage. It seems weird to me that that tiny little percentage is the ones that everybody focuses their attention to all of the day, all of the time these days.
Yeah,
And I think within any scene, there's always mavericks. But let's not
sure.
assume for any second that we are those mavericks. So yeah, we should follow the majority path, I believe, in these arts.
I feel like it kind of goes back to what we were saying earlier about the discernment and the ability for people to recognize authentic information. Because I feel like what's true is typically not often very comfortable or pleasant, at least initially,
Yeah.
because usually what's true implies something needs to change, which means we're somehow inefficient or ineffective in some way, which all of those things are uncomfortable because it threatens our identity. Or if we're just lazy, it's like, oh, great, I got to do work. Like, versus these people come along and they're like, actually, just have sex and take drugs and eat as
Yes.
much ice cream as you want or whatever other thing, just indulge. And everyone's like, oh, now I think this is the truth. I think this guy gets it.
Totally, yeah. I mean, there's a simple rule. If you're not sure of the validity of a method, if it involves your testicles, it's probably not a valid method. I think that's probably a safe rule. Um, but I think the other thing, the problem with truth, is because we work very much on a dualistic level. That's who we are as human beings, isn't it?
Right.
Opposition is very much how our brains work. Is the reason truth is so uncomfortable is because it presents to you the fact that on the other
Ah,
side of the coin is dishonesty. So it shines a light on the lies and the fabrications that maybe you've created or maybe you've adhered to or something like that. And to me, that's a large part of the role of, like I don't, I'm using the word in a way, like guru. I don't
sure.
like the modern concept of guru, of course, the kind of what it's become. But the idea of a guru, wasn't it, was to shine light on the darkness or dispel the darkness. And
Mm.
as far as I'm aware, a large basis of this was essentially by pointing you all towards truth so that it took away the darkness of the dishonesty or the lies.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of um, my first introduction to Chinese arts and my first time meeting someone that actually had some small degree of skill in more like external kung fu and acupuncture. My first session with him, basically, like there was no intake. He didn't do anything. There was no conversation, just showed me to the bed and then that was it. But then
Okay.
he walked in and was just like, look, you don't really need treatment, you just need reprogramming. And then he just spent the next 90 minutes like dissecting my character and my past, my makeup, like all of this stuff. And I'm like, what? Like you don't, how do you know all this stuff? And the thing is, it was actually accurate because I'd met people before that were like psychics or whatever, and I'm just like, this is not even remotely accurate. And it was like clear, specific, precise. But so I worked with this guy for a while, and it was always this stuff about like, well, maybe look at it this way. Not that he is in any way, shape, or form like enlightened or awakened or any of those things. It was just reminded me of like how uncomfortable that process was initially, but I just kept going because I was like, this is actually correct and what I need to do, even though I don't actually like it and I find it to be quite unpleasant and I don't actually understand what he's talking about at all. And that actually, that's what inspired me to actually want to learn because I was like, why does he see things this way? Why, how is he able to see this and know this? And why does he look at the body in this way? So then I was like, okay, I need to learn and then eventually, after a few years of training with you, and I was like, oh, now I get why he was saying what he was saying. And I would go back to him and be like, here's this, this, and this. And he was like, yeah, exactly. That's finally you're closer to understanding things a little bit more accurately. And I was like, oh, okay. But my point is, it was not pleasant. It was not
Yeah,
particularly
sure.
enjoyable, but it was useful. But the other thing too is I I've trusted him and I respected him. So you know, and it wasn't yeah, it was a good scenario. So that actually kind of reminds me of another thing we mentioned on earlier, but I wanted to go back and clarify is because we've talked about compartmentalization, we've talked about understanding what a teacher means versus, you know, what you mean, and then when you go to a new teacher, really understanding what they mean by that term because that could be different than, you know, another teacher, right? Like chi or any of these concepts. So with within modern times, there's the idea that spirituality and Eastern arts, it's kind of like vague and subjective. When I think the reality is that we've been kind of dancing around, is it's actually not vague or subjective like at all. It seems pretty like concrete, crystal clear, even for things like you were saying, enlightenment, awakening, self-realization, all these different things. So I guess my question for you is within each of these traditions, is it basically it's mapped out, right? I mean, it's mapped out, it's defined, it's clarified, and that is the role of the teacher is he has the map, he has the guidebook, he's been through it, and he can discern A plus B or step plus one and two or all those different things. And all of those, you know, these huge terms are actually defined. And then are there actual units of measure or tests for those types of things? Or is it just kind of like something a little more vague? Hopefully that makes
Yeah,
sense.
no, it's yeah. Well, first of all, before I answer that, I would say the
Uh-huh.
practitioner you went to sounds very skilled. So I hope more people go to see that particular practitioner because I think that skilled practitioners are quite unfortunately rare these days. So I hope he does well with what he's doing. So
Yeah,
good good for
he's
you to
actually
comment like that.
he's retired now.
Oh, no, well,
He
there you
he
go. I
made
hope he's
he made
enjoying
millions of
retirement
dollars
instead.
off of Amazon stock and decided to stop treating people.
Oh, well, that's a shame. One less skilled practitioner out there. Never mind. As long as he's enjoying retirement.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very very yeah, it's completely mapped out. The whole idea of vague concepts, I don't really understand because I mean, with regards to scripture or something, certainly within traditions I'm familiar with, then yeah, it's very mapped out. I mean, no one could ever look at a Buddhist text
Yeah.
and say it wasn't very defined. I mean, they define everything down to excruciating levels of detail. Alchemical texts from the Taoist tradition are very similar if you understand the symbology, but they're still very specific. They're almost like a DVD instruction manual or something when you're looking at them. Yeah, it's usually defined. I think the vague terms have people turned them into vague because they didn't understand, or have they made them vague because it suited their purposes to not have a clear definition of what things were so they could overlay their things on? I'm not sure. I don't know. It's probably a bit of both. But yeah, the traditions are highly specific. And I think you're asking specifically about signs of levels of attainment and stuff as well, aren't you? So something like enlightenment, for example. Yeah, I mean, completion of the path, to be fully awake or whatever, to be a Buddha, perhaps, if you want to use that term. Yeah, there are clear markers for it. So one of which being that, of course, that the practitioner could see through to every level of subtlety of the causal realm, through to each of the heaven realms, through to the various states like Bardo, and even down to the the realms of punishment, like the hell realms and things like this, which are specifically stated within the Eastern arts, are a thing. They're not a concept. These days, when I see Buddhists saying that, oh, hell is a state on earth and heaven is a state on earth, like some kind of John Lennon song or whatever, no, that wasn't their concept. That wasn't what they were talking about. These are realms of stratification of existence that are higher and lower than the realm of matter and senses we're caught in. So somebody at that level should be able to perceive all of those things, which I can't. So therefore, I've realized I'm not enlightened. Clearly, that marker has shown me that, no, I'm not at that level. No argument there. So, but then even if somebody could be dishonest about that kind of perception, well, you also then come with all kinds of magical abilities as well, including the ability to shrink down and travel through physical matter, or to materialize in multiple places at the same time, or project 1,000 images of yourself into the sky, or, as Buddha did, levitate in the air, spewing fire and water out of his pores at the same time. These are fairly well-defined, to me, not metaphorical symbols to show that somebody has completed the path. Now, on that level of, that's the kind of fire level. Then, of course, on the spectrum of abilities or attainments or whatever, like stages of development in your practice,
Sure.
they all have similar markings and abilities and things that come with different stages. If we go right down to the other end of the spectrum, to the more basic level, for example, when the Dantian consolidates, then we have very simple markers, like it will first become hot because there's still resistance in the tissues in the area. And once that resistance in the tissue in the areas releases, it will feel like it bubbles, meaning that essentially the field of the Dantian is switching on and off to create small, like anti-slip ABS brake kind of movements in your abdomen. And then it will close and it will swallow the chi. Think about swallowing it. It means like something contracts and closes on the inside of it. Like there's very, very clear markers, and you can go
Yeah.
all the way through the steps of progression, and they're all spelt out. So there should be no delusion or confusion whatsoever on this path at all of where you are. But in order to accept that, you also have to accept a couple of things which might be difficult, which is first that the path is very defined, as you're saying, and not vague. And then the second thing we have to accept, I suppose, perhaps on faith at the beginning, is that maybe some of the skills they're talking about or the signs aren't myths and legends, and maybe are more literal than you realize. Now, I know that that's difficult for many people in a modern logical Western scientific mindset, whatever you
Yeah.
want to call it, to accept. But for me, and I agree, I had to witness some of these things, not levitating fire and water, but on a lesser scale, I had to witness some of these things being done, which is a part of the role of the sort of heads of traditions to demonstrate at least lesser versions of these skills, to get you a foot in the door, to show that literal. And then all of a sudden, all of those writings, you realize, yeah, these ancient people, they didn't write in metaphor, they wrote literally. They told the truth, which is weird. Who'd have thought that a spiritual practitioner would tell the truth? It's an odd quality, isn't it, that you wouldn't expect. So with that approach, my take on the arts is very, very different. So I'm not bothered by, but I do think
Right.
it's a little low class, perhaps,
Sure.
when you get people claiming to be awakened or enlightened, or at the most, perhaps they're realized to the nature of self. You might say self-realized if they've gone quite deep into their practice. But I think the standards have dropped. The standards have dropped, which, as I
Yeah.
said, it's the hardest thing a human being can ever do, right? What's more likely? You're going to become a top Hollywood actor, or you're going to develop the ability to perceive through to all of the realms of existence and materialize yourself 1,000 times in the sky. I think it's quite clear which is harder.
Yeah, I
But
think
when I've said this to people, a lot of people think I'm crazy. They think I'm crazy. And my counter argument to people, why are you doing the Eastern arts?
yeah.
Why did people disappear for lifetimes up into the mountains to practice? Do you think they were going up into the mountains and spending their life in isolation, giving up their existence, giving up their
Yeah.
families, giving up all worldly pleasures when they could have just had an ice bath? Like, I don't think so. There's maybe there's a couple of leaps we need to make on how complicated or how deep these arts can go and how deep reality is as well.
I feel like one way I've looked at it is the mind, or people have a tendency when they encounter something new or things like this to either admit that it's true and that they are obviously not at that level, which that's uncomfortable.
Yes.
So I think the other option is, oh, well, it must be a metaphor or it must be an analogy or it must be something else because I can bring this standard all the way down here to something that makes me feel more comfortable now, and I don't have to admit that maybe I don't have that skill level. I think that's
Yes.
oftentimes what happens. Um, and I think, yeah, if it's, well, I guess I can see both sides. I feel like on one hand, a healthy degree of skepticism is probably useful because there are so many charlatans, and I mean, we won't get into it, but I
Yes.
mean, all the guys wearing the electrical generators on YouTube. I mean, obviously, that looks amazing, and that could dupe a lot of people, but in reality, it's nothing more than what it is. So it's like I understand the skepticism, and I think like just going back to my own experience, like I was having, my Dantian was moving around, but my mind still wasn't completely on board. But then eventually the
Yeah.
process got so tangible that my mind was just like, oh, huh. And then that kind of
Yes.
opened the door of, oh, well, if this is true, then, huh. Then it becomes, oh, okay. So I think that's sometimes part of I think that's the beauty of having chi and these practices being more tangible is because it just can
Yes.
kind of give the mind a more of an aha, like, oh, okay. And the other thing it reminds me of is I think modern people, to go back to what we were saying earlier about, we're living in this golden age. I think there's an assumption for a lot of people is that we're really smart now and we know more than they did. But I think it's actually the opposite. I think, at
Yes.
least for me, I feel like I'm kind of an idiot and like kind of a peasant. But these high level teachers and people that created the traditions, actually, they were much more intelligent than I can even conceptualize because it's almost like
Well,
comparing a donkey to like a Formula One car. It's like they're
yes.
not even remotely sure they both move, but like the
Yeah.
functioning and the complexity is not the same. So I feel like that's something a
Well,
lot of people get backwards.
I think that in the past they were masters of the inner technology. I think these days we're masters of the outer technology. I mean, I think we've mastered the engine and the computer far better than they ever did, but they were just looking a different direction for sure. That we can't pretend for a second we understand the workings of the universal reality anything like the people who founded these traditions, unless you're going to completely reduce all of the spiritual arts to psychology, which is what a lot of people try to
Yeah.
do. Try to do. To make the profound something mundane is, or the opposite, to make something mundane really profound. It just, I, yeah, it all goes back to that same idea that there's a lack of truth.
I think this perfectly segues to my next question, which might be the densest, and it'll be our last kind of jumping off point, which is the role and importance of cosmology within these arts, meaning how
Yeah.
important it is for a practitioner to, for one, I guess, even know that they have a cosmology. Because
Okay.
a lot of people just assume like I'm a modern person, so everything I know about what a human is and what the world is just absolutely true because it is. When in
Yeah.
reality, it's called the Big Bang Theory for a reason. You know what I mean? Like it's
Right.
not
Yeah.
like it's called the theory of evolution. Like all these things that are our bedrocks of our fundamental reality are not as concrete as people often assume, right? And I think
Sure.
this also ties into the like, I'm a modern person, so I'm smart and I'm evolved and I'm gonna go do these kind of silly, funny arts because of whatever reason. I
Yes.
think this is a big thing. So, I mean, what is the role and importance in cosmology? And if someone is, I mean, have you seen someone who's really, really locked into like the modern materialist, worldview, super into politics and reading fucking New York Times and all this kind of constrictive, heavy ideology, I mean, are they going to really make progress? And then on the other extreme, these very far out new age people that are, have the opposite, like they're just so dispersed and so ungrounded. Like,
Yes.
so on both of these extremes, I'm guessing I'm circling around to my question, which is like the importance of cosmology for the practitioner.
Yeah, I mean,
It's,
it's a
it's kind of
dense
a lot
question.
there. Sorry for that word salad, but
No, 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 no. I'm thinking about, as you're saying it, I'm thinking about examples actually of what I would consider master level practitioners and whether they fit into either of those two camps. They fit into both and neither.
yeah,
I think generally is so that I think there's a certain degree of fluidity that is required
sure,
with regards to your approach to life. So if I think about my teacher, he said things before that are quite out there, quite yeah, like quite new age language, but then within the next minute he'll will be discussing geopolitics with Russia or something. So
right,
there's a fluidity between them, but I would say that
sure,
more of a problem is there's no particular attachment or obsession to either. I think that's
exactly,
probably more important than anything else. So I've very rarely seen him or other teachers of that level adopt the conventional view towards a political situation or anything. So I would say the cosmology is almost irrelevant. There's an awareness of world events that is
sure,
still there. They still live in the world. There's an awareness of things that are taking place, but I wouldn't say that they adhere to a particular conceptual understanding of the world. So there's always it's quite disorientating communicating with them in some ways because you can't quite pin down where they're going to come from. So maybe I haven't answered your question very well. I apologize if I haven't, but I think the cosmology, if I'm using the word the same way as you, as in a particular worldview, I assume you're using it a particular
yeah. I mean,
way.
I did kind of I did a poor way of explaining the question, but your answer is definitely good so far.
Okay.
So what I was trying to get at in a lot of different ways is like
Yeah.
cosmology, meaning like what you believe a human being is, and like what
Oh,
you
sorry, I
believe.
misunderstood. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I did a shitty job of of explaining it.
I have a small vocabulary, Brandon. I apologize.
Yeah. No, I mean, your answer was good and relevant, obviously, as well. I just think, yeah. So like the basic assumption of what we believe a human being is, and then how that's relating to the world, because
Right, I get you. Okay.
each art and each tradition obviously has their own idea of this is what a person is, this is how we're interacting with the larger context. And my point is like if you're like a rigid materialist, like this is all there is, and like science is the religion and the Big Bang and that's it, like that's obviously not the same cosmology as a tradition, right? So that's
I
what I was
get you.
saying
Yeah,
is
yeah.
the
Both ways. Yeah.
importance of a person's cosmology or belief system in those regards fitting into or aligning with a tradition, and is that an important part of the process, and is that something that your teachers had spent time with you, or is it just something that you said it's just kind of like whatever.
I get you. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah,
Actually, that's a perfect example of why every term must be defined. Because like even a colloquial, a conversational term like that, I have a different idea of what cosmology is. To me, it's more of the conceptual framework through which people view life, rather than I didn't know the way you're using it. So if you
oh
can't
yeah,
even define the word cosmology like that the same, how can we define deeper spiritual terms? So interesting example. But okay, so on that particular definition, actually, no, I'll change my answer a little bit then, actually. That there is a fluidity and a relevance that is encouraged at the early stages of practice. So therefore, it's unhealthy to have a very fixed idea of the human being within the relationship to the universe, whether materialistic or otherwise,
right,
because the idea is that your cosmology, in that sense, becomes a reality once you can directly know or experience the nature of what it means to be a human being within reality and what the nature of reality or existence is. So, for example, the teacher I have now, I would say that the way that he has taught me or explained the nature of reality or who I am as a person or what human beings are has shifted consistently over 10 years because my understanding through direct experience has
Ah,
changed. So therefore, the way we can discuss things is different. So when I first met him, it was almost materialistic. The
ah,
language was very, that's obviously what he saw in me. He obviously decided I was a shallow materialistic person. So the terminology was very much about that. We were discussing the physiology of humans and our place, and even evolution was something that was discussed to a certain extent. Move it on a decade after my at least shoddy attempts at the practice, whatever depth I've managed to achieve. And now the discussion of the nature of a human being and its place in the universe is completely and utterly different and shifted. Because more important than having a fixed idea is having an idea that two people can communicate according to the level they're at.
mm,
So, for my part, the faith on my part, I don't believe in blind faith, but I do believe in intelligent faith. I think that's
sure.
an important distinction. My part for the faith of me is that I trust that this person that's teaching me has greater insight into the nature of all these things. So, in many ways, it's not my place to question
Right.
too much, think about, consider, see how it fits with my own worldview, but not to outright say it's wrong, because
Sure.
if I didn't have that faith in that person, I wouldn't be studying with them. And their role as a teacher is to allow those concepts to constantly shift so that they're still true, but they're relevant to the level that as a student I'm at. So it does that answer at all? That's where the
Abs
non-fixedness of the idea comes in. And once someone becomes very rigid on this is reality and this what it is, then they're already kind of stuck, really. Because it's only been given to them.
yeah.
I mean, it's only given to you. And why would you say, oh, I don't have faith in what this spiritual teacher is saying? But as you say, you have faith in the Big Bang. Why? You didn't see it. You didn't
Sure.
experience it. No scientist has. They have evidence, they have concepts. And then because you were told it at school over and over, you believe it's a more real thing, any more than the extreme Christian who's brought up in the church. You believe the whole thing was created in 7 days by a man who created light and sound. I mean, that why I don't know why people believe that their view is so valid that it can't shift or change anyway. I don't that would seem to be a shortcoming on their part.
Yeah, I think that I answered it perfectly. Just as an aside and a tangent, it reminds me of another video I made that was obviously very popular, where I said that for people that are really invested in the Big Bang and creationism, that there was a huge functional and mechanical overlap because they're both basically saying something we don't know and we don't understand did something that we don't know and we don't understand, and now here we are. And I was just like, science went so far away from religion that it just circled back around. But because it sounds different, they're like, "Oh, now we get it." But it's like it's just because, historically they really just wanted to break away from the church and be like, "Oh, we got to get away." But then it's like they just came right
Yeah,
back around. So that always entertained me, but other people don't find it quite as humorous. Um, but I think
that's
well, I think if I hear what you're saying, what I'm taking away is that it's not like you walk in and you have this fixed idea, this is what a human being is. It kind of is reiterating the idea we've been going around, which is people are kind of taught according to their level or according to where they're at. And then it's a process of transformation. So obviously that's going to be constantly changing and evolving, right? And growing as you
yeah,
hopefully grow and progress. And the other thing is that it's almost kind of what we were saying earlier about you're the product, which is it's not that you change the the cosmology of the practice. It's more so that the practice turns around and changes your cosmology and informs your perception based on your direct experience.
yes. And we have to understand that with regards to spiritual cultivation or reality in general, everything is only a conceptual framework until you realize the truth. And because none of us have realized the truth, we're just living in conceptual frameworks. That's it. That's life, isn't it? As far as I
Yeah.
can see. And then we argue about them.
Yeah. That is very true. I think that sums up a lot of A lot of what consumes a lot of our time is just arguing over varying degrees of conceptual models. Um, but I
I
think
think so.
ultimately it kind of highlights a lot of the beauty and the potency of the arts. So it's like a way to actually access and like tangibly experience many of these grandiose concepts, right?
Yes. Yes, direct knowing is the aim of all of these things, not direct experience. That's
Oh,
not that
yeah.
helpful because experiences are already lost in the sense faculties and distorted by perceptions. But direct knowing is what they're all trying to aim for, essentially,
Yeah.
and that doesn't involve your testicles usually.
Unless you're at a high enough level, right?
Yeah, true. Which case the testicles cease to exist. Actually, on the level of subtle work, it would seem strange if you could still use the physical matter. But there you go. That's a discussion for another time, perhaps.
Yeah, I think so. We'll have to do a whole other podcast just on the cosmology of testicles.
I'll do it while swinging weights the whole way through if you want the video.
Actually, there was a friend of a friend who had this Xing teacher in America, and this guy
Yeah.
famously had his wife hanging. So the guy was standing on the roof of his house, and his wife was suspended by a rope off of his testicles.
As a punishment or
He was just demonstrating his chi.
wow. Okay. Well, I'm not at that level, so I should train harder.
Yeah. And then the friend of a friend that went and did a test, he had to test for his teacher. He
Yeah.
speaking of deviance, he knocked on this hotel room door and the guy was actually having a threesome with two prostitutes while the guy was testing and showing his form.
Yeah.
So,
I've heard similar stories. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, coming to terms with sexual energy is something that a lot of people seem to struggle with for some reason. I don't know why, but yeah, that it would seem to be stuck on a fairly basic level of not really getting it, I would say, with
Yeah,
regards to these practices. Yeah. Yeah. Whenever
absolutely.
I hear something like that or a teacher has that kind of, I don't know, like, what are you going to learn off that person? Nothing good, nothing wholesome, that's for sure.
It's just the nature of internal arts, at least these days. It just seems to be, you just hear these wild stories of these wild characters. It's like from a comic book or something. Um,
Yeah. Was it ever any different? I don't know, but I hope so. I hope so.
I mean, so
That's why I believe that the morals and values should come back to the arts. I
yeah,
just think they should. I think we should hold ourselves, if not others, but certainly ourselves, in a very high level of expectation for how we should behave, and we should be strict with ourselves on these things so you don't end up in a hotel with a threesome with two hookers whilst you're supposed to be doing a Xingi assessment or whatever it is that he was doing. And I mean, the fact that someone would end up in that situation is kind of ludicrous. But it
yeah.
should be seen as so. Yeah, I think.
So if people take away anything from this podcast, it's definitely ignore all practices that have to do with your testicles. Just if you take
Yeah,
away nothing else, just that. That's
yeah, totally. Well, if nothing else, it would shut out 50% of the population from our schools. So yeah.
yeah. Well, that's all the questions I had so far today. I feel like we covered a lot of good stuff, and I'm hoping that people will walk away with a wider context of really the closer to the nature of these arts, how powerful they are, how powerful they can be, also how much of a pain in the ass they are actually. Like, at least for me, people will
Yeah.
ask me if they should do them, and I say no, unless you, unless you want to ruin your life and or you're like really OCD and obsessive kind of person, just just don't. Just have a normal life, like go swimming, go running, do other things of activity. Like this is not recommended.
I agree. Go and do yoga
Yeah, I feel like
instead.
I was thinking laughing about this earlier today. It's like best case scenario, your body ends up looking like kind of a pudgy, doughy snowman. It's like great,
Yes.
cool.
The filling is not a flattering process. No, unfortunately. No.
It's like oh, it just
The
reminded
funny
me. I
thing is,
saw what's that?
when you emit chi, you deflate again. Actually, so it does balance out that way. So you'll see people that do a lot of chi building and chi emitting, their bodies actually go up and down a little bit. I don't know if people notice that. They yo-yo, they get bigger like a balloon, then they shrink down. It's very weird how the body copies that process.
I mean, I think if we look at pictures of Damo pre
One
27,
second,
sure.
sorry. Hi guys, can you give me 5 minutes? Okay, cool. Yeah, sure. Thanks guys, I'll be with you in a minute. Sorry about that, Brandon. I
No
apologize.
problem. I was just
I didn't
saying to
see the
illustrate
time.
that. What?
I didn't see the time. There's a class upstairs. Yeah,
Oh, okay, yeah. Well, we can wrap and
they
just.
can wait.
Oh, okay. I was gonna say even if we look at pictures of Damo like pre 2017-ish, I remember
Yes.
you because we only saw you every few months. You left, you were normal, and then you came back again and you were like obese. And I was like, huh.
Yes.
Just,
And then the filling. Yeah, totally. It was at that stage I was hitting the chi filling in a really big way, and then my body blew up, right? And then
yeah.
right now it's gone down again a little bit, and that's because I've had to issue chi in a big way, maybe 3 or 4 times in the last few months or something like that. So now I'll hit a refilling stage, and my body will go up again. That's what will happen. Yeah, you become like a yo-yo dieter, chi yo-yo dieting. It's the nature of it.
So people have that to look forward to.
It goes back to the thing that there's a tangible physical reaction to what happens with regards to energetics. The fabric of reality sits on a subtle level. So if you increase the energy of the fabric of reality, then it's building up in your body. It will cause you to expand. I mean, I know you want to wrap this up, but even on the same level, people who enter jhana, generally in meditation, if you want another sign, is your body gets bigger. It expands. It
Huh.
pushes the bones out in all directions as a byproduct of that meditative space. So if someone is built like a streak of piss and they say they're doing jhana, it's highly unlikely actually, or they haven't done it in a long time, because your body transforms according to these things. Yeah, I think that should be wider knowledge. Personally, that should be more known.
Yeah. I feel like whenever I've talked to people about any of the arts, that's usually the thing I always try to emphasize is the tangibility and the like
Mm.
real rubber meet hits the road kind of reality of the
Yes.
thing. And
Yeah,
then
yeah,
even with like the benefits or what makes an exercise do anything for you, it's like I've had people like touch my body and they're just kind of like, huh? Like it just it doesn't
yes,
compute, you know?
yeah,
Um,
yeah. Because
so it's
you've changed the way your body functions, so it doesn't function in a conventional level that external people would understand. That should be it. It means you're doing well. Yeah.
yeah, it's yeah, I mean even as an individual going through it, it's always super cool to observe, you know, especially after you train, you're like, oh, wow, things feel different. Okay, nice.
Yes.
So yeah, if people can walk away with anything, it's definitely the tangibility factor of all of this stuff. And I think that was a lot of the background reasoning why I was asking the questions that I was asking is to try and correct some of the kind of missteps and misassumptions about doing these practices because at least for myself, you know, it definitely has held me back at various times. People I've taught, it's definitely held them back. And for a lot, just looking at the dialogue online, I can see like people are struggling with some of these ideas. So
Yes.
hopefully it's useful, and also hopefully for you it's been entertaining and not repetitive or monotonous.
No, not at all. Not even slightly. And it's always really nice chatting with you, Brandon. One of the hardest things is the only time I ever see you is when I'm on courses with lots of people. So I don't get time to chat with people because there's so many people there. But yeah,
Right.
so thanks very much. It's been nice talking with you.